It was a pleasant afternoon in St. Mary Mead, the sort of day that inspired one to feel particularly appreciative of life in a quiet English village. The sun shone in gentle waves across the well-manicured lawns of Ashworth's house, where Mrs. Emily Lockridge was hosting her annual garden party, a staple of the social calendar. It was an event where ladies of good breeding and gentlemen of respectable standing gathered to discuss, with great enthusiasm, subjects of utmost importance, such as whose roses were failing, who had been seen at the vicarage too frequently, and who had mysteriously taken to wearing mourning attire without any apparent loss. Miss Jane Marple, in her usual delicate lace gloves and wide-brimmed straw hat, sat at the edge of the festivities, sipping her tea with quiet attentiveness. She had been engaged in friendly conversation with Miss Charlotte Weatherby, an elderly lady who never shied away from the phrase, "Well, I wouldn't want to gossip, but—" "Oh, Miss Marple," Miss Weatherby whispered, leaning in slightly, "have you heard about the curious affair at Lockridge Manor?" Miss Marple set her cup down with mild interest. "Lockridge Manor?" Miss Weatherby nodded, eyes sparkling with the thrill of having fresh news to share. Mrs. Lockridge's niece, Eleanor, arrived unexpectedly from London 2 nights ago. Terribly distressed, they say. And this morning, can you imagine, she locked herself in her bedroom and refused to come out. Miss Marple's delicate brows lifted. "Oh dear, that does sound rather unusual." "Unusual, my dear. It is scandalous." Miss Weatherby lowered her voice further. "The maid, Lucy, swears she heard raised voices last night. A terrible row between Mrs. Lockridge and Eleanor. And now the girl won't unlock her door." Miss Marple's fingers gently smoothed the lace of her gloves. "How very odd." At that moment, the chatter of the gathering was interrupted by the arrival of a flustered Mrs. Lockridge herself, a well-preserved woman in her 50s. Mrs. Lockridge had the dignified air of someone who believed in proper appearances, though the tension in her face betrayed a great deal of strain. "Miss Marple," she called, her voice uncharacteristically loud. "Miss Marple, I must have a word with you." Miss Weatherby's lips pursed with excitement, but Miss Marple simply folded her hands in her lap, her manner composed. "Of course, dear Mrs. Lockridge. What is the matter?" Mrs. Lockridge cast a wary glance around before lowering her voice. "It's Eleanor. We cannot get into her room. The door is locked from the inside, and she won't respond to us. We've tried everything. The housekeeper swears the key is missing, and then I fear something is terribly wrong." Miss Marple observed her carefully. The woman's distress seemed genuine, though beneath it there was something else, hesitation, perhaps fear. "Have you sent for anyone?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "I sent one of the footmen to fetch Dr. Hayward. He should be arriving any moment. But I do not know what to do." The garden party had fallen silent now, ears attuned to the unfolding drama. A locked door, a missing key, and a young woman in distress. Such things were not common occurrences in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple rose from her chair, dusting the crumbs from her skirt. "Perhaps I might be of assistance." Mrs. Lockridge's shoulders visibly relaxed. "Oh, Miss Marple, you always seem to know what to do." Miss Weatherby, now practically quivering with intrigue, piped up, "I shall come along." To Mrs. Lockridge, ever conscious of propriety, pursed her lips. "Perhaps it would be best if we kept this private, Miss Weatherby." Miss Weatherby looked slightly put out, but Miss Marple only gave a gentle smile. It is always best not to cause undue alarm. And with that, she followed Mrs. Lockridge across the lawn, leaving behind the whispering partygoers who had already begun to weave their own theories about the mystery of the locked wardrobe. The imposing house of Lockridge Manor stood at the edge of the village, an elegant structure with ivy creeping along its stone facade. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Servants stood near the staircase, their hushed whispers filled with uncertainty at the top of the grand staircase. Outside the door to Eleanor's room stood Dr. Hayward, a sensible man with a kind but firm demeanor. He looked up as Mrs. Lockridge and Miss Marple arrived. "Thank heavens, Mrs. Lockridge. I was about to break down the door myself." Mrs. Lockridge wrung her hands. "But we haven't even tried to see if she will answer. I have knocked repeatedly." Dr. Hayward interrupted, his voice calm but serious. "There's been no response." Miss Marple stepped forward, peering at the ornate wooden door. "And the key is missing, you say?" Mrs. Lockridge nodded. "Lucy, the maid, swears she always leaves it in the lock before retiring for the night. But when she came up this morning, it was gone." Miss Marple's fingers brushed along the smooth doorknob. "Most curious." She gave a gentle knock. "My dear, it is Miss Marple. I do hope you're quite all right." Silence. Dr. Hayward exchanged a look with Mrs. Lockridge, then tried the handle again. It was firmly locked. Miss Marple turned to Lucy, who stood anxiously nearby. "Tell me, dear, when you last saw Miss Eleanor, was she in good spirits?" Lucy hesitated. I don't rightly know, miss. She seemed troubled, nervous even." Mrs. Lockridge exhaled. "That is precisely why I am so concerned." Dr. Hayward placed a hand on the door. "We must get inside. Fear something may have happened to her." Mrs. Lockridge pressed a handkerchief to her lips. "Oh, dear Lord." Miss Marple, however, remained calm. She turned her gaze to the floor, scanning the space just beneath the door. A flicker of light glinted off something, an odd shadow. She tilted her head. "How strange." Dr. Hayward turned. "What is it?" Miss Marple pointed. "The wardrobe." Lestrade blinked. "The what?" Miss Marple gave him a patient look. "The wardrobe, doctor. Look at its reflection in the mirror across the room. Does it not seem out of place?" Dr. Hayward followed her gaze, his brow furrowed. "You know, I do believe it has been moved." Mrs. Lockridge frowned. "But why?" Miss Marple leaned down slightly, peering under the door again. "Unless I am very much mistaken, I believe that wardrobe is pressed against the door." A horrified gasp escaped Mrs. Lockridge. "You mean?" Miss Marple straightened, her expression turning grave. "I mean, dear lady, that Miss Eleanor did not simply lock herself in her room." She paused, letting the moment settle. "Someone locked her in." A cold silence filled the corridor. Dr. Hayward took a step back. "Then we must break the door down at once." Miss Marple simply nodded, her face unreadable, for she suspected that whatever lay beyond that door was far worse than they had imagined. The breaking open of Eleanor Lockridge's bedroom door sent a ripple through the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, like a stone cast into still water. It was not every day that such a dramatic event occurred within the grand halls of Lockridge Manor, and certainly not the kind that sent servants whispering in the corridors or caused Dr. Hayward's expression to darken as he stepped into the room. Behind him, Miss Marple observed keenly as the door swung inward, revealing a scene of eerie stillness. The large oak wardrobe had indeed been pressed against the door from inside, confirming Miss Marple's suspicion. It took the combined strength of Dr. Hayward and a footman to shove it aside. The heavy piece of furniture scraped across the wooden floor, revealing its own trailing unnatural placement that had not been meant to go unnoticed. And then there was Eleanor Lockridge herself. The young woman lay on the four-poster bed, fully dressed, her dark curls splayed across the pillow. A teacup and saucer sat untouched on the nightstand beside her, a faint perfume of lavender and citrus still clinging to the air. She did not stir. Dr. Hayward approached quickly, kneeling at the bedside. "She's alive," he said at last, exhaling in relief, but heavily sedated. Mrs. Lockridge pressed a trembling hand to her chest. "Sedated? How?" Dr. Hayward turned toward the untouched cup. "Something in the tea, I'd wager." Miss Marple stepped forward, peering down at Eleanor with a soft, unreadable expression. How fortunate, then, that the intention was not to do her lasting harm. Mrs. Lockridge blinked at her. Fortunate. But who would do such a thing? Dr. Hayward pursed his lips. That is precisely what we must find out. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the teacup, then moved toward the wardrobe once more. The placement had been deliberate, but not perfect. There were no scratch marks near the base of the door, which suggested. Her gaze flickered to the window, slightly ajar, and just beyond it the slanted stone ledge of the manor's second-floor balcony. Ah, very interesting, Dr. Hayward, Miss Marple said softly. Would you say Miss Eleanor has been unconscious since last night? He frowned. Difficult to say, but judging by her breathing and color, I'd estimate she's been under for quite some time. He glanced at Mrs. Lockridge. When was the last time she was seen? Mrs. Lockridge hesitated. At dinner. She seemed agitated, but then she retired early. Miss Marple hummed in thought. And no one checked on her before this morning? Housekeeper, Mrs. Hollis, spoke up from the doorway. Begging your pardon, ma'am, but Lucy did. She's the one who found the door locked. She knocked several times, but got no answer, so she alerted the mistress. Miss Marple nodded slowly, letting the weight of the details settle in her mind. A young woman locked in her room, drugged but not harmed. A wardrobe deliberately placed to block entry, but not entirely convincing in its execution. It was a puzzle, a very peculiar puzzle. Indeed, by the time Miss Marple returned to the village, rumors had already taken flight, carried by hushed voices over teacups and across garden hedges. At Mrs. Weatherby's tea room, where the scent of freshly baked scones lingered in the air, the local ladies had already begun forming their own theories. I heard Eleanor was found dead in her room, said Mrs. Partridge dramatically, lowering her voice despite no one else being within earshot. Miss Charlotte Weatherby shook her head. Oh no, dear, she's not dead, though I heard she was quite near it. Mrs. Finch, a woman of unshakable certainty, sniffed. Mark my words, it was an elopement gone wrong. Elopement. Miss Weatherby leaned in, fascinated. Mrs. Finch nodded sagely. A young woman arriving suddenly from London. A secret quarrel with her aunt. Then, suddenly locked in a room overnight. She tapped her spoon against her saucer. It all points to an unsuitable romance, if you ask me. Miss Weatherby gasped. Do you suppose she meant to run away and was stopped? Mrs. Partridge pursed her lips. Or was she being kept there on purpose? This notion sent a collective shiver through the group, and for a moment no one spoke, until, at last, the soft clearing of a throat made them all turn. Miss Marple, who had been quietly stirring her tea, gave a small, polite smile. One must always be careful with assumptions, she said gently. Things are not always what they seem. The ladies blinked at her, taken aback. Mrs. Finch recovered first. Well, of course, Miss Marple, but surely you must admit, it's all very peculiar. Oh, most peculiar, Miss Marple agreed. But then, most things are, when one does not yet have the full picture. She took a sip of tea, her mind already forming patterns beyond what the others could see. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a leisurely stroll past Lockridge Manor. From the outside, it looked perfectly normal, its gardens neatly trimmed, its windows reflecting the dappled sunlight. But Miss Marple knew better. Somewhere within those walls, a secret was waiting to be uncovered. A person had gone to great lengths to ensure Eleanor Lockridge remained locked away. But they had failed to account for one simple thing. The human mind is far more revealing than any locked door, and Miss Marple has spent a lifetime learning how to read it. The village of St. Mary Mead hummed with quiet anticipation. Lockridge Manor had become the center of whispered speculation, the kind that traveled swiftly through back gardens and across shop counters. By the following morning, Miss Marple had already set about her quiet investigation, not by asking direct questions, of course, but by listening. People revealed the most when they believed they were simply having a friendly chat at the greengrocer's. Mrs. Bellamy, the vicar's wife, had much to say as she inspected a bundle of carrots. She remarked on the shocking nature of Eleanor Lockridge's sudden return to the village. How unexpected it was, and how she must have had a dreadful reason for leaving London so abruptly. She recalled Eleanor as a solemn child, always watching, always listening, a girl with more intelligence than was good for her. It had been a sad affair when she lost her parents, sent off to school, away from the home she had once known. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, encouraging Mrs. Bellamy to continue. The woman hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as though reluctant to share gossip, but unable to help herself. Eleanor had never quite fit in with her aunt's household. Mrs. Lockridge, though always outwardly gracious, had not taken to the role of guardian easily. There had always been a strain, an unspoken distance between them. Miss Marple considered this carefully. People did not always take kindly to obligations they had not chosen, and Mrs. Lockridge was a woman of pride. But there was something more at play here. Eleanor's unexpected return, the quarrel, the locked room, and the presence of fear, none of it aligned with a simple family dispute. Miss Marple meant to find out why. By the afternoon, she made her way back to Lockridge Manor. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hollis, received her with visible unease, her hands twisting together as she spoke in hushed tones. The mistress was distraught, and Miss Eleanor, though awake, was still not quite herself. Miss Marple reassured her, asking only for a moment to speak with the girl, convinced that gentle company might do her good. The bedroom had been tidied since the morning's events, the wardrobe returned to its proper place, the tea tray removed. The curtains were drawn just enough to let the daylight in without it being too harsh. Eleanor sat in a chair by the window, her expression pale and guarded. When she turned to look at Miss Marple, there was recognition in her eyes, but also hesitation. Miss Marple greeted her with warmth, but Eleanor did not respond immediately. When she did speak, her voice was hoarse, uncertain. She did not know what had happened. She remembered going to bed, feeling tired, but everything after that was a blur. Miss Marple did not press her, but instead guided the conversation gently, asking about her sudden return to the village. Eleanor hesitated again, then admitted that she had been afraid. She had left London because of something or someone. There was a flicker of something in Eleanor's face when Miss Marple asked whether that someone had followed her to St. Mary Mead. She did not answer, but her fingers curled slightly against the armrest, betraying a tension that told Miss Marple all she needed to know. Eleanor had fled, not for a casual visit, but because she was running from something very real, and someone had ensured she remained silent. As Miss Marple left Eleanor's room, she nearly collided with Mrs. Lockridge, who had been standing outside. There was something guarded in her expression, though she smiled politely, her voice carefully measured as she expressed gratitude for Miss Marple's visit. She hoped Eleanor had not troubled her too much. Miss Marple assured her that the girl was no trouble at all, but noted, in her own quiet way, that Eleanor seemed unsettled. Mrs. Lockridge's expression tightened ever so slightly before she smoothed it away, agreeing that the poor girl had been through quite an ordeal. Miss Marple watched her carefully. There was something off about the woman's manner, something that went beyond a simple concern. It was not quite relief, not quite worry, but something in between. As though she knew more than she was saying. On her walk home, Miss Marple turned these thoughts over in her mind. Eleanor Lockridge had fled London, arriving unexpectedly at her aunt's home in visible distress. She had quarreled with Mrs. Lockridge, then had somehow ended up locked in her room, sedated. And now, the woman who was supposed to be her guardian seemed nervous, uneasy, As though trying to conceal something, Miss Marple paused at her garden gate, looking up at the sky as the first few clouds of the evening drifted by. There was something missing from this picture. A person had gone to great lengths to ensure Eleanor remained silent, but the question was why? And, more importantly, had they succeeded? Because Miss Marple had the distinct feeling that this case was far from over. Would you like me to proceed with the next section, where the police become involved and the first suspect emerges, though Miss Marple remains unconvinced? By the time the village constable arrived at Lockridge Manor, the rumors had grown into something far larger than the truth itself. It was inevitable, of course. News traveled quickly in St. Mary Mead, but embellishments traveled even faster. By now, it was said that Eleanor Lockridge had been found on the brink of death, that she had written a mysterious farewell letter, and that a strange man had been seen lurking near the manor gardens the night before. None of it, naturally, was entirely true, but speculation had never needed facts to take root. Constable Graves was a thorough man, if not particularly imaginative. He had heard the whispers, and they had made him all the more determined to bring the matter to a close as swiftly as possible. Miss Marple observed his arrival from a seat in the Lockridge drawing room, where she had been invited to take tea with Mrs. Lockridge under the pretense of offering company and comfort. Mrs. Lockridge had seemed eager to have her, there perhaps too eager. A woman burdened with secrets, Miss Marple often found, was one who sought distraction as the front door opened, bringing in a gust of cold air along with the constable. Mrs. Lockridge's teacup rattled ever so slightly against the saucer. "Oh, thank heavens, Constable," she said, rising swiftly. "This dreadful situation, well, I trust you shall get to the bottom of it." Constable Graves removed his hat, giving a small nod. "We'll do our best, ma'am. Understand Miss Eleanor is still resting?" Mrs. Lockridge smoothed her skirts. "Yes, Dr. Hayward advised against disturbing her for the time being." "It's quite right," Graves agreed, though Miss Marple noted the slight downturn of his mouth, as though disappointed. "Still, I'll need to speak to those in the household, starting with the maid, Lucy." At the mention of Lucy, Mrs. Lockridge hesitated. It was only a fraction of a second, but Miss Marple saw it. "Of course," Mrs. Lockridge said at last. "I shall have her sent in." Lucy was a nervous young girl, barely 18, and she twisted the hem of her apron in her hands as she stood before them. She had been the one to first discover Eleanor's locked door, and now she stood before the constable, answering questions in a voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir, I found the door locked first thing in the morning," she said, her wide eyes darting between them. "I knocked, but Miss Eleanor didn't answer. I thought perhaps she was still sleeping, but something about it felt wrong." Miss Marple watched her carefully. The girl's distress was genuine, but there was something else beneath it, something unspoken. Constable Graves nodded. "And you're sure the key was missing?" Lucy swallowed. "Yes, sir. I always leave it in the lock before I go to bed. But in the morning, it was gone." Miss Marple took a gentle sip of tea. "That must have been very unsettling for you, my dear, to find something out of place in such a familiar household." Lucy nodded quickly. "It was, miss." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And tell me, dear, did you hear anything in the night? A sound? A disturbance, anything that struck you as odd?" Lucy's hands tightened around her apron. Mrs. Lockridge's sharp gaze flickered toward the girl. The moment stretched. Then, hesitantly, Lucy spoke. "Well, I thought I heard something. Soft noise, like a door creaking, but I can't be sure." Constable Graves scribbled something in his notebook. "Okay. Did you leave your room at any time?" Lucy's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, no, sir. I stayed in bed." Miss Marple nodded, watching her closely. "Of course, dear. But that is rather curious, isn't it?" Lucy blinked. Miss Marple smiled kindly. that you heard a door creak, yet your own door remained firmly shut. Lucy's throat bobbed as she swallowed. I suppose so. Miss Marple set down her teacup. Then, my dear, which door do you suppose it was? Silence. Mrs. Lockridge's fingers curled against the armrest of her chair. Constable Graves looked up from his notebook. That's a good point, Miss Marple. He turned back to Lucy. Did you hear footsteps? Movement? Lucy hesitated for only a moment, but Miss Marple caught it. Then, shaking her head quickly, Lucy said, No, sir. I must have imagined it. Miss Marple glanced at Mrs. Lockridge and caught the quick relief that passed over the woman's face. Now, that was interesting. Constable Graves seemed satisfied, though Miss Marple was not. Very well, he said, closing his notebook. I have a few more people to speak to. It seems clear that Miss Eleanor was deliberately locked in, and we must find out who had the means and the motive to do so. Miss Marple turned back. To Lucy, her expression unreadable. Someone in the house had locked Eleanor away, but had it been to keep her in or to keep something else out? After Lucy had been dismissed, Constable Graves addressed Mrs. Lockridge again. I'd like to speak to the rest of the household, ma'am, including Mr. Lockridge. Mrs. Lockridge stiffened. My husband. Surely you don't think he had anything to do with this? The constable raised an eyebrow. It's procedure, ma'am. Miss Marple observed her reaction carefully, a nervous glance toward the door, a flicker of hesitation before her composed mask returned. Of course, Mrs. Lockridge said at last. But my husband is away on business. He won't return for another 2 days. The constable nodded, jotting something down. And where is Mr. Geoffrey Harding, the guest staying in the house? Mrs. Lockridge's composure remained intact, but Miss Marple noticed a slight pause before she answered. He is in the library, I believe. Miss Marple kept her expression neutral, though her thoughts were racing. Geoffrey Harding, old friend of the Lockridge family, invited to stay just before Eleanor's sudden arrival. A man barely mentioned in the chaos of the previous day. A man who had yet to be accounted for. The puzzle was shifting. A locked door, a missing key. Young woman in distress. Miss Marple smoothed her gloves over her lap, her blue eyes twinkling. She had the feeling that soon the true game would begin. The halls of Lockridge Manor seemed heavier in the late afternoon light, as though the very walls carried the weight of the secrets held within. The house was quiet, unnaturally so, as Miss Marple followed Constable Graves toward the library, where Geoffrey Harding was said to be waiting. Miss Marple had long since learned that silence often meant more than words. And in this house, there was an abundance of it. Geoffrey Harding was a name that had hovered at the edge of the conversation since the beginning of the mystery. He was an old family friend, invited by Mrs. Lockridge just before Eleanor's unexpected arrival. But he had been conspicuously absent throughout the turmoil of the past day. And now, with Eleanor's poisoning and the deliberate barricading of her door, his presence in the house was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Mrs. Lockridge had sent word for him, and now, as they stepped into the grand library, Miss Marple took her first good look at the man in question. He was seated in one of the high-backed leather chairs, his posture at ease, though there was something calculated in the way he rested his hands along the arms of the chair. He was in his mid-40s, well-groomed, the slight air of a man accustomed to being charmed rather than questioned. When he looked up, his expression was polite, but Miss Marple detected the slightest flicker of wariness behind his carefully set features. Constable Graves cleared his throat. Mr. Harding, I hope we're not interrupting your afternoon. Geoffrey Harding smiled faintly, setting down the book he had been reading. Not at all, Constable. I imagine you have questions about the disturbance yesterday. Miss Marple watched him keenly, noting the choice of words. Disturbance, a rather light term for a young woman locked in her room and poisoned. Constable Graves nodded. You've been staying here as a guest of the Lockridges, correct? Yes, Geoffrey said smoothly. Mrs. Lockridge invited me to spend a few weeks in the country. London has been quite demanding as of late. And how well do you know Miss Eleanor? Geoffrey hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. I knew her when she was younger, of course. She was always an independent sort of girl, if I recall correctly. But I haven't seen her for years, so her arrival here. Miss Marple noted the pause. Hesitation before certainty. Constable Graves jotted something down. And where were you on the night of her arrival? Geoffrey's smile did not waver. In my rooms, reading. You didn't hear any disturbance. None at all, Geoffrey said lightly. But then, I sleep quite soundly. Miss Marple spoke for the first time, her voice gentle. How very fortunate, Mr. Harding. It must be a great relief to have a peaceful night's sleep, even in a house where such distressing events have taken place. For a brief second, something flickered in his gaze. A recognition, perhaps, that Miss Marple saw more than she let on. He smiled. I do my best to keep my mind at ease, Miss Marple. Never solved anything. She tilted her head. Oh, I don't know, dear. I've always found that a little worry can be quite revealing. Constable Graves shifted slightly, clearing his throat. Did you see Miss Eleanor at all that evening? Geoffrey's response was smooth. No, I can't say that I did. But Miss Marple did not miss the way he glanced, just for a moment, toward the nearest window. After Geoffrey had been dismissed, Miss Marple took her usual, slow, deliberate stroll around the manor. She had always found that houses, much like people, had ways of speaking, if one simply knew how to listen. She passed by the staircase, glancing toward Eleanor's bedroom door, now fully open. The scene had been reset, the furniture restored, the tea tray removed. The room made ordinary again, but Miss Marple knew better. She stepped inside, her eyes drifting toward the wardrobe, the object that had kept Eleanor locked in her room. It was a sturdy thing, dark mahogany, the kind of furniture that took deliberate effort to move. She leaned forward, pressing her fingers along the side, where the polish had been worn ever so slightly. Their faint indentation, as though something had once been wedged beneath it. She straightened, eyes drifting toward the floorboards just beneath the bedside table. A slight gleam caught her attention. Miss Marple bent down, retrieving a small, silver button. She turned it over between her fingers. It was not ordinary a fine button, the kind found on well-tailored coats. Not the sort of thing a young woman would wear. She slipped it into her pocket. Geoffrey Harding had been wearing a well-tailored coat. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself back in the drawing room with Mrs. Lockridge, who seemed eager to steer the conversation away from Eleanor's condition. She's always been a dramatic girl, Mrs. Lockridge said, sipping her tea. I expect this whole affair will be terribly exaggerated in her mind. She's quite sensitive, you know. Miss Marple stirred her tea delicately. Oh yes, I imagine she is. But then, one must wonder what she had to be so sensitive about. Mrs. Lockridge's expression did not change. Just a young girl's imagination, I expect. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. Perhaps. She set down her spoon, watching Mrs. Lockridge closely. Mrs. Lockridge, dear, I wonder if you might tell me something rather curious. How did Mr. Harding come to stay here? Was it entirely your invitation? Mrs. Lockridge blinked. Why, of course. I wrote to him myself. Miss Marple nodded. And when was this? Oh, some weeks ago. Miss Marple tilted her head. Before or after you learned that Eleanor was coming? For the first time, Mrs. Lockridge hesitated. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her fingers tightening ever so slightly around her teacup. Miss Marple said nothing. Mrs. Lockridge exhaled, forcing a smile. Before, of course, just before. Miss Marple nodded pleasantly, but she did not believe her. As Miss Marple walked home through the twilight streets of St. Mary Mead, She turned the small silver button over in her pocket. Geoffrey Harding had arrived just before Eleanor. He had been invited, supposedly, without knowing she would be there. But his reaction earlier, his hesitation, his gaze shifting toward the window, those were not the habits of a man unconcerned. The button had been in Eleanor's room, near the wardrobe that had kept her locked inside, and Miss Marple had the distinct feeling that Mr. Harding had not spent his night quite as peacefully as he claimed. The sun had begun its slow descent over St. Mary Mead, casting long golden streaks over the village lanes as Miss Marple made her way back toward Lockridge Manor. The small silver button in her pocket felt heavier than it should have, a tiny but significant clue that suggested Geoffrey Harding's involvement in Eleanor's mysterious imprisonment. Miss Marple knew that true revelations were rarely made through direct confrontation. People did not confess when accused, they revealed themselves in the way they responded to the unexpected. And so, when she arrived at Lockridge Manor once again that evening, she did so with deliberate subtlety. The house was quieter than before. Mrs. Lockridge had retired early, citing a headache, and Lucy, the maid, had been given the evening off to calm her nerves. Only the presence of Geoffrey Harding and Dr. Hayward lingered in the drawing room, their conversation hushed until Miss Marple's arrival. "Miss Marple," Dr. Hayward said, rising from his seat. "Have you come to check on Eleanor?" She smiled warmly. "Indeed, Doctor. But I must say, it's also rather pleasant to have a little conversation in good company." Geoffrey Harding tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "The lady of the house is indisposed, I take it." Miss Marple lowered herself gracefully into a chair. "Yes, poor dear. The strain of the last few days has been rather unfortunate." Dr. Hayward sighed. "It's an unsettling business, to be sure. But at least Eleanor is improving, She's awake now, though still very weak." Miss Marple stirred her teeth thoughtfully. "How fortunate, and I suppose we shall all feel much better once we know precisely what happened to her." At this, Geoffrey gave a small, calculated smile. "Well, isn't that the question?" Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes twinkling. "Indeed it is. You know, Mr. Harding, I was thinking about that wardrobe. Such a large, heavy thing, isn't it? It must have taken a strong hand to push it into place." Geoffrey Harding did not react immediately. Instead, he took a slow sip of his brandy before answering. "You don't think poor Eleanor did it herself?" Miss Marple gave a gentle laugh, as if the thought amused her. "Oh, hardly. She was already unconscious, wasn't she? That's what makes it so fascinating." She set down her cup. "You see, I happened to find this in her room." She withdrew the small silver button and placed it on the table between them. Dr. Hayward peered at it curiously. But it was Geoffrey who stilled. It was only a moment, but Miss Marple saw it. The faintest flicker of recognition, quickly masked by his usual charming indifference. My, he said, taking another sip of brandy. "A button, is it?" Miss Marple nodded pleasantly. "Yes, a rather fine one, wouldn't you say? It's the sort that belongs to a well-tailored coat, quite unlike the style Miss Eleanor would wear." Dr. Hayward furrowed his brow. "Then, whose could it be?" Miss Marple turned her gaze to Geoffrey. "Well, Mr. Harding, do you not recognize it?" Geoffrey set down his drink and leaned back. "Should I?" Miss Marple's voice was mild. "I thought perhaps you might, given that I notice your coat is missing a button." Charged silence filled the room. Dr. Hayward straightened in his chair, glancing between them. "Is this true, Harding?" Geoffrey smiled, but it was not. His usual easy charm was tighter now, controlled. "Perhaps, Taya, I hadn't noticed." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "How very curious, then, that a button so like yours should be found in Eleanor's room, near the very wardrobe that had been pushed against the door." Geoffrey met her gaze. "I suppose you mean to suggest that I locked her in." Miss Marple's voice was soft. Did you? A pause. Then Geoffrey gave a low chuckle, shaking his head. Miss Marple, you certainly have a way of leading people down a path, don't you? Dr. Hayward's frown deepened. You were in her room that night. Geoffrey sighed, as if the whole thing were an inconvenience rather than a damning revelation. Fine. Yes, I went to see Eleanor that evening. Miss Marple's expression did not change. Why? Geoffrey's mouth tightened slightly. She seemed troubled. She'd been arguing with Mrs. Lockridge, and I wanted to see if she was all right. Miss Marple watched him keenly, and Geoffrey hesitated. She was upset. She wouldn't say why, but she kept insisting that she needed to leave the house. She was frightened. Dr. Hayward's voice dropped. Frightened of what? Geoffrey shook his head. She wouldn't say, but she was desperate. I told her she needed to rest, to think clearly before making any decisions. She didn't listen. She tried to leave, so I stopped her. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Stopped her. Geoffrey exhaled. I didn't lock her in, if that's what you're implying. I only meant to calm her down. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. Cool. And yet she was found locked in her room, unconscious. The wardrobe was moved. Candy button was there. Geoffrey's jaw clenched. I didn't drug her. Dr. Hayward studied him, but you were the last person to see her conscious. Geoffrey did not answer. Miss Marple leaned back slightly, watching him. It is all rather troubling, isn't it? A man visiting a frightened young woman late at night? Quarrel? A missing button? She let the words hang in the air. Geoffrey's fingers tightened around his glass. Miss Marple's voice was soft, thoughtful. But you see, Mr. Harding, the real question isn't simply why you were there. It's who else was. Dr. Hayward frowned. What do you mean? Miss Marple glanced toward the library window, where the manor's second-floor balcony was faintly visible. Oh, I think we've been looking in the wrong place for our intruder. Dr. Hayward followed her gaze, then turned back to her. Believe someone else entered Eleanor's room that night. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, I believe someone else was watching. And I believe they saw far more than they were meant to. Geoffrey's lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. And I do think we shall soon find out who. Dr. Hayward's hesitation was brief but telling. Miss Marple had long since learned that people often revealed the truth in what they didn't say just as much as in what they did. She studied the doctor with mild interest as he composed himself, and continued, Well, Miss Marple, a sedative of that nature is not entirely difficult to acquire. A trained physician, such as myself, might prescribe it for patients suffering from insomnia or nervous conditions. Miss Marple nodded. Quite so, doctor. But Eleanor was not your patient, was she? Dr. Hayward exhaled. No, she was not. And yet, someone procured it for her. Dr. Hayward glanced at his desk, then leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly. It was not stolen from my practice, if that is your next question. I keep careful records of my stock. Miss Marple smiled gently. Oh, I wouldn't dream of implying such a thing, doctor. I was only wondering if you did not provide it. Who else in this household might have had access to such a thing? Dr. Hayward hesitated. You mean to say it was deliberate? Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. Oh, doctor, don't you think it rather unlikely that Eleanor, so suddenly distressed and eager to leave the house, would have administered a sedative to herself? Dr. Hayward exhaled sharply. No, of course not. But that would mean that someone in Lockridge Manor ensured she would not leave that room. Dr. Hayward fell silent, considering. That would mean the person who drugged her was also the one who locked the door. Miss Marple's smile deepened. Or, perhaps more interestingly, that someone drugged her to prevent her from leaving. And another person saw an opportunity to make sure she stayed locked away. Dr. Hayward stared at her, his frown deepening. It's two people, you think? Miss Marple sighed. "Oh, dear doctor, I do believe we have quite the tangle of threads before us." That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to Lockridge Manor, only to be greeted at the door by a very pale and flustered Lucy. "Oh, Miss Marple," the maid whispered, wringing her hands. "It's happened again." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. What has happened again, my dear?" Lucy looked over her shoulder toward the staircase. "Miss Eleanor, she was nearly attacked." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice remained perfectly calm. "Tell me everything." Lucy nodded quickly. "I was bringing Miss Eleanor some tea. Just now she's still weak, you see, and I thought something warm might do her good. But when I reached the door, it was ajar." Miss Marple's brow lifted. "Oh, yes. And just as I stepped inside, I saw a shadowy figure, someone dressed all in dark clothing, standing over her bed." Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "And what did this person do?" Lucy swallowed. "When they saw me, they ran straight out through the balcony door." Miss Marple's mind whirred. "Did you see their face?" Lucy's shoulders sagged. "No, miss. It all happened too fast." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "It was very brave of you to go in, Lucy." Lucy blushed slightly at the praise. "Oh, I don't know, miss. I just—" Miss Marple gave her an encouraging nod. "And tell me, dear, when you entered the room, was Miss Eleanor awake?" Lucy bit her lip. "No, miss. She was still sleeping, didn't even stir." Miss Marple's fingers drummed lightly against the fabric of her skirt. How curious, because Eleanor had already been given a strong sedative the night before, and yet, even now, she still had not awoken. Mrs. Lockridge's reaction to the incident was immediate. "Eleanor must be moved at once," she declared, her face drawn and pale as she paced the drawing room. "She is clearly not safe here. Shall send her back to London to a hospital, perhaps." Miss Marple sat quietly, watching her. Dr. Hayward, standing by the fireplace, cleared his throat. "She is in no condition to be moved just yet, Mrs. Lockridge. The girl has not even woken up properly. It would be dangerous." Mrs. Lockridge turned, her hands trembling slightly as she pressed a handkerchief to her lips. "But whoever tried to get to her today, what if they try again?" Miss Marple spoke at last. "Yes, dear. What if they do?" Mrs. Lockridge froze for a moment. Then, gathering herself, she gave a tight smile. "That is precisely why I must act quickly." Miss Marple observed her carefully. "You seem very eager to have Eleanor leave." Mrs. Lockridge stiffened. "Would you not be, Miss Marple, if your household had been attacked twice in 2 days?" Miss Marple gave a slow nod. "Oh, quite. But one must also consider." She took a sip of her tea, then looked up, her eyes twinkling. "What Eleanor herself would want." A silence settled in the room. Then Mrs. Lockridge turned away, pressing her handkerchief to her face once more. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward Geoffrey Harding, who sat quietly in the corner, watching the exchange with careful disinterest. So many unspoken conversations, so many hidden tensions. But Miss Marple had the distinct sense that the answers were drawing nearer. That night, as Miss Marple sat in her cottage, reflecting over the case, a sharp knock came at the door. It was Dr. Hayward. His coat was slightly damp from the mist rolling in over the village, and his expression was urgent. "Miss Marple," he said, breathlessly, "you must come at once." She rose immediately. "What is it?" Dr. Hayward exhaled. "Eleanor. She's woken up." Miss Marple's heart quickened slightly, and she remembers everything. The night air was damp with mist as Miss Marple followed Dr. Hayward up the familiar steps of Lockridge Manor. The house loomed ahead, its tall windows glowing faintly with candlelight, but there was a sense of unease in the stillness of the grounds. Something had shifted. Miss Marple had always believed that truth was like water behind a dam at first contained. But once a crack formed, It would rush forward, unstoppably. Tonight, it seemed, the crack had finally split open. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. Lucy met them at the door, her face still pale with worry. "She's awake, miss," she whispered urgently. "Yes, and she's asking for you." Miss Marple gave the girl a reassuring pat on the hand before making her way toward Eleanor's room. The last time she had seen Eleanor, the young woman had been motionless, lost in an unnatural sleep. But now, as she stepped into the dimly lit chamber, she found a different Eleanor altogether. The girl was sitting up in bed, though still pale, her dark eyes wide with lingering fear. Her fingers clutched the blankets tightly, as though holding onto something unseen. When she saw Miss Marple, her lips parted slightly, her breath catching. "Miss Marple," she whispered. I thought I'd never wake up." Miss Marple moved to the chair beside her. "But you have, dear, okay? And I think, perhaps, you have something to tell me." Eleanor swallowed, glancing at Dr. Hayward, who gave her an encouraging nod. She closed her eyes briefly, as if trying to gather her courage, then exhaled shakily. "I remember now," she said. "I remember everything." Leno's voice was unsteady as she began. "I came here to escape," she said. I hadn't told my aunt why. I wasn't sure if I should, but I knew I needed to get away from London." Miss Marple nodded patiently, waiting for her to continue. Eleanor's hands tightened around the sheets. "There was a man, someone I knew back in London. He was—" She hesitated, her voice dropping. "Someone I thought I could trust, but I discovered something terrible." Dr. Hayward leaned in slightly. "What did you discover?" Eleanor shuddered. "Okay. He wasn't who he said he was." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "You mean he was leading a double life?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes. I overheard something I wasn't supposed to. A conversation. He was involved in something illegal. I don't know the details, but when he realized I knew," she swallowed, her voice shaking, "I became a problem." Dr. Hayward's expression darkened. "You were in danger." Eleanor nodded. "That's why I came here. I thought I'd be safe." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "But you weren't, were you?" Eleanor let out a trembling breath. "No." She closed her eyes for a moment, then whispered, "Because he followed me." The room was silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Eleanor's fingers gripped the sheets tighter. That night, I couldn't sleep. I felt uneasy, as though someone was watching me. I kept hearing strange sounds, like a door creaking, footsteps on the landing. Miss Marple's eyes flickered. And then, Eleanor swallowed. I got up. I thought maybe it was just my nerves. But then I saw the balcony door was slightly open, and when I turned, she hesitated, her face pale. I saw him. Dr. Hayward stiffened. "Inside your room?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes, standing in the shadows, was wearing dark clothing. I could barely see his face, but I knew it was him." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. What did he do?" Eleanor trembled. "Told me I had to come with him. That it wasn't safe for me here, he said. He said if I left quietly, I wouldn't get hurt." Dr. Hayward clenched his jaw. "He threatened you?" Eleanor nodded. "I tried to scream, but he grabbed me, covered my mouth, and then, I don't know. My head felt heavy. I couldn't think. I felt drowsy." Miss Marple exhaled softly. "He drugged you?" Eleanor's breath hitched. "Yes, he must have. Because the next thing I remember, I was lying in bed, and he was moving the wardrobe." Marple exchanged a glance with Dr. Hayward. "To keep others from reaching you." Eleanor nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to fight it, but I couldn't move. Everything went black after that." Miss Marple sat back slightly. "And you're quite certain of who it was?" Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then nodded firmly. "Yes, I didn't see his face properly, but I'm sure of it. Miss Marple leaned in slightly. Then, my dear, tell us his name. Eleanor exhaled shakily. His name is Stephen Langley. The name seemed to linger in the air, pressing down like the weight of an unseen storm. Dr. Hayward frowned. Lily Langley. That name sounds familiar. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her voice remained mild. Oh, it ought to, Doctor, 'cause, if I am not mistaken, she turned her gaze toward Eleanor. Mr. Langley has a rather particular connection to someone in this house. Eleanor blinked. What? Who? Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. Why, dear, to Geoffrey Harding. Eleanor gasped. Geoffrey? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, you see, Mr. Harding and Mr. Langley were once in business together. A rather unfortunate business, I expect. And when you stumbled upon Mr. Langley's secret, it was only a matter of time before Mr. Harding learned of your discovery. Dr. Hayward inhaled sharply. And Harding was already in the house. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. Indeed, Doctor. Which leads us to a rather interesting question. Eleanor looked between them, her breathing uneven. What question? Miss Marple's eyes darkened. Was it Langley who locked you inside that room? Or was it someone who wanted to ensure you never spoke the truth? A silence stretched in the room. Dr. Hayward straightened. Then, that means, Miss Marple nodded. That means, dear doctor, that Eleanor is still in danger. Outside the manor, the mist clung thickly to the trees, swallowing the night in its quiet embrace. Somewhere, beyond the gates, someone was watching. Stephen Langley was still out there, and now he knew Eleanor remembered everything. The revelation of Stephen Langley's name had shifted the course of events at Lockridge Manor. Eleanor, pale and shaken, had been taken under Dr. Hayward's care, while Mrs. Lockridge had excused herself, claiming a terrible headache, retreating to her rooms with a troubled air. But Miss Marple noticed one thing very clearly. It was not fear that had crossed Mrs. Lockridge's face when Langley's name was spoken. It was something else entirely, something much closer to recognition. Now, seated in the quiet drawing room, Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully, her gaze drifting toward Geoffrey Harding, who stood near the window, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The flickering candlelight illuminated the deep lines at his brow. I must say, Miss Marple, he murmured, this entire situation is growing increasingly inconvenient. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. Oh yes, Mr. Harding. Secrets do have a way of becoming rather troublesome, don't they? His gaze flickered toward her, assessing, before he chuckled lightly. I have no secrets, Miss Marple. Miss Marple took a dainty sip of her tea. How very fortunate, dear. I do find that secrets tend to entangle their keepers sooner or later. From the doorway, Constable Graves entered, looking slightly flustered. We've received word from London, he said, directing his attention toward Miss Marple. Police have begun searching for Langley. If he's truly come to St. Mary Mead, it won't be long before we find him. Miss Marple's hands folded neatly in her lap. I do hope so, Constable, but I rather think we shan't need to go looking for Mr. Langley at all. Constable Graves frowned. And why is that? Miss Marple smiled, her voice deceptively mild. Because, dear Constable, he shall come to us. Geoffrey Harding scoffed, but Miss Marple caught the slight tension in his fingers. And why on earth would he do that? Miss Marple set down her teacup with a delicate clink. Because Eleanor Lockridge is the one person who can ruin him completely. And he knows now that she remembers everything. The next morning, Eleanor was moved from her bedroom. It was Dr. Hayward who suggested she be placed in a more secure room, one without a balcony, without a second exit. Mrs. Lockridge had protested at first, but in the end, it was Miss Marple's quiet insistence that convinced her. Safety, my dear Mrs. Lockridge, she had said sweetly. Surely you wish to keep Eleanor safe. And so Eleanor was taken to a smaller guest room with only one entrance and a heavy wooden door that locked from the inside. But what no one outside of Miss Marple and Dr. Hayward knew was that Eleanor was not inside that room at all. Miss Marple had convinced Eleanor that the safest place for her was not to be seen at all. Instead, the young woman had been moved to Dr. Hayward's surgery in the village, where she would rest under watchful care. And in Eleanor's place, in the bed beneath the dim candlelight, lay a carefully arranged figure, a bundle of blankets and pillows, its form appearing as though someone were sleeping soundly beneath them. A deception, a trap. Now, all that remained was to wait for this intruder to return. The house remained silent through the early evening, but Miss Marple knew that the quiet would not last. She sat in the drawing room with Dr. Hayward, Constable Graves, and Geoffrey Harding, speaking in calm tones about the affairs of the manor, about Mrs. Lockridge's growing distress, about the lingering air of fear that clung to the halls. But all the while she was listening for the telltale sounds of the night. And then, at precisely 1 hour past midnight, it came, a soft creak from upstairs. Miss Marple stilled, her hand tightening slightly around her teacup. She met Dr. Hayward's gaze, and he gave a nearly imperceptible nod. From the darkened corridor beyond the drawing room, Constable Graves shifted slightly, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. They did not move yet. The sound came again, the unmistakable groan of an opening door. Someone had entered the guest room, someone who believed Eleanor lay helpless inside. A quiet footstep, then another dot. Miss Marple let out a soft breath, and then a loud crash. "Stop right there," Constable Graves' voice rang out, followed by the heavy clatter of footsteps. Miss Marple rose swiftly but unhurriedly, following the others into the corridor. As they rushed up the stairs, they found the door to the guest room flung wide open, and in the middle of the room, struggling against Constable Graves and Dr. Hayward, was a man in dark clothing, his face twisted in fury. Stephen Langley. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching. "Where is she?" he snarled. Miss Marple stepped forward, her hands still calmly clasped in front of her. "Oh, Mr. Langley, dear, did you truly think we would leave Eleanor unprotected?" Langley's face contorted with rage. "You?" But he had no chance to finish. Constable Graves wrestled him into submission, forcing him against the floor as a cold snap of handcuffs followed. "It's over," the constable muttered. "You're done." Langley struggled for a moment longer, then stilled his chest, rising and falling heavily. Miss Marple looked down at him with kind but unwavering eyes. "You may have followed Eleanor here, dear, but you didn't fool me for a moment." Langley's gaze flickered, but he said nothing. The room fell into a thick silence. Then, from the doorway, another voice spoke. "No, Miss Marple," Geoffrey Harding said quietly, stepping forward. "Langley didn't fool you. But tell me, Miss." Marple turned her gaze toward him. "Did I?" The room grew colder, the weight of Harding's words settling over them like a sudden storm. Constable Graves and Dr. Hayward froze, their grips still firm on Langley. But now their attention had shifted. Harding's expression had changed. No longer the indifferent guest, as a casual observer. Now, in his eyes, there was something else, something dangerous. Miss Marple exhaled softly. "Oh, Mr. Harding," she murmured. "I was wondering when you would stop pretending." A hush settled over the grand guest room of Lockridge Manor, broken only by the heavy breathing of Stephen Langley, now restrained on the floor. But no one was looking at him anymore. All eyes were on Geoffrey Harding. He stood just inside the doorway, his hands clasped behind his back in an air of polite indifference, as though he had merely wandered into the scene rather than become its centerpiece. Miss Marple, ever calm, studied him with a soft but knowing gaze. She murmured, her voice almost affectionate. "How very long you must have been waiting for this moment, Mr. Harding." Harding's lips curved slightly, but there was no warmth in the gesture. "I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple." "But of course you do," she replied, mildly. "You see, dear, you made one very crucial mistake. You believed yourself to be the only person playing the game." Constable Graves tensed. "What you saying?" "Oh yes," Miss Marple continued. "It was never just Langley." Langley, still struggling against the constable's grip, let out a breathless laugh. "Took you long enough," he muttered, shaking his head. Dr. Hayward turned to Harding, eyes narrowed. "You were working with him?" Harding exhaled sharply, as though annoyed at the idea. "Don't be absurd. I had nothing to do with this man's incompetence." Langley sneered. "You're quick to abandon a business partner, aren't you?" "Harding," Miss Marple tutted gently, as though chastising a wayward schoolboy. "Oh, Mr. Harding, I do believe Mr. Langley has just given himself away, but unfortunately for you, he has given you away as well." Harding's expression darkened slightly, but he remained unmoved. "You're making quite a lot of accusations, Miss Marple." She nodded agreeably. "Oh, yes, I am. But you see, I rarely make accusations unless I am quite certain they will stick." Dr. Hayward, still watching Harding closely, spoke next. "I don't understand. If Langley was the one who tried to take Eleanor, how does Harding fit into this?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Why, Doctor, it's very simple. Mr. Harding was never trying to take Eleanor at all." Dr. Hayward frowned. "What was he doing?" Miss Marple's smile did not waver. "He was trying to silence her." The room seemed to shrink with the weight of those words. A flicker of something passed over Harding's face, but it was gone in an instant. Miss Marple continued, her voice light but unyielding. "You see, Mr. Harding, you made a very critical erring. You thought we would all assume that Langley, being the obvious villain, was the only one after Eleanor. And, of course, dear Langley played his part very well. The dark clothing, the balcony entrance, the menacing presence. A classic diversion." Langley let out a bitter laugh. "And you thought I was the mastermind, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple sighed. "Oh no, dear. You were simply the hired knifer, rather the reckless fool. The real danger was always the man standing in the shadows." Dr. Hayward stiffened. "But why? What did Harding stand to gain from silencing Eleanor?" Miss Marple turned toward Eleanor, whose face had gone pale once more. "Because," Steve said softly, "Eleanor knew something neither of them could afford for her to say." Eleanor swallowed. "About Langley's criminal dealings." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, dear. About Mr. Harding's." All eyes turned to Harding. His expression remained impassive, but his fingers had tightened slightly behind his back. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "Oh, Mr. Harding, you tried so very hard to remain a bystander, didn't you? A quiet, inoffensive guest caught in the middle of an unfortunate crime. But you see, dear, I happened to find something rather interesting in Eleanor's room." She reached into her pocket and withdrew the small silver button. Harding's jaw clenched. "This," Miss Marple said, holding it up, "is from your coat, is it not?" Harding said nothing. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "And yet it was found inside Eleanor's room, near the wardrobe that had been used to lock her in." Dr. Hayward's expression darkened. "So he was there?" Miss Marple nodded. "Oh yes, Doctor, but not to help Eleanor, not in the slightest. You see, Harding did not expect Langley to come barging into the house so soon, but when he did, well," she sighed, "it presented something of a conundrum." Dr. Hayward frowned. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple's voice dropped slightly. "Langley was planning to take Eleanor, but Harding's plan was not to take her at all." Eleanor shuddered. "Then what was he planning?" Miss Marple's eyes darkened. "To ensure she never left that room alive." A sharp silence filled the space. Miss Marple turned back to Harding, watching him carefully. Langley drugged her, but it was you, Mr. Harding, who ensured that she remained trapped. You were going to let the drug do its work. Dr. Hayward's breath caught. But that means, Miss Marple nodded. That means Eleanor would never have woken up. Eleanor let out a shaky breath. But why? What did I know that was so dangerous? Miss Marple turned to her, her voice gentle. My dear, it was not what you knew. It was what you had. Eleanor frowned. Had. Miss Marple nodded. Somewhere in your belongings, you carried something you did not even realize was valuable. Some document, some proof perhaps, something you had simply taken by accident when you fled London. And Harding, being far cleverer than Langley, knew that as long as you were alive, there was a risk of discovery. She turned back to Harding, her gaze unreadable. And that, dear sir, was something you could not afford. Harding stood still, his face unreadable. Then, at last, he sighed. Well, Miss Marple, he murmured. I must say, Marple. Miss Marple gave a small, pleasant nod. Oh, I do try. And then, with surprising calm, Harding reached for the poker by the fireplace. Constable Graves lunged. Drop it, Harding. But Harding was quick. He swung the poker up and Miss Marple, ever composed, simply stepped aside as Constable Graves tackled him to the ground. The poker clattered onto the floor. And Harding's struggling ceased as the weight of his defeat settled over him. Miss Marple let out a soft sigh, smoothing the lace of her gloves. My dear Mr. Harding, she murmured as Constable Graves bound his wrists. You should have known better, she smiled. One should never underestimate a lady with a knitting bag. By the following morning, Lockridge Manor had returned to its usual outward calm. The house stood tall against the misty countryside, its pristine gardens undisturbed, its grand windows reflecting the light of a new day. But inside, a great shift had taken place, one that had finally unraveled the tangled web of lies and deception that had ensnared its halls. Geoffrey Harding and Stephen Langley were in the custody of Scotland Yard. Constable Graves had escorted them both to the station at dawn, leaving behind a household still reeling from the truth. Mrs. Lockridge, pale and drawn, had taken to her room once more, unable or perhaps unwilling to face the events of the past few days, and Eleanor Lockridge, though shaken, had finally found her voice again. Miss Marple sat with her in the drawing room, her hands folded gently over her knitting as Eleanor recounted the final missing pieces of the puzzle. When I left London, Eleanor said quietly, I took only what I could carry: a suitcase, a few books, my purse. I had no idea that something among my things was dangerous. Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind. And yet, my dear, that was precisely why Harding sought to silence you. Eleanor exhaled shakily. But what was it? What did I have? Dr. Hayward, seated across from them, cleared his throat. Scotland Yard found several documents hidden among Harding's belongings after his arrest. Ledgers, financial records, evidence of fraudulent transactions. He frowned. It seems Harding and Langley were involved in a smuggling ring, using forged business contracts to transport stolen goods. Eleanor's breath caught. But I don't understand. What did that have to do with me? Miss Marple's voice was gentle. You said before that you overheard a conversation in London, that you learned something you would never meant to know. Eleanor nodded slowly. Yes, I heard Harding's name mentioned, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Miss Marple gave her a knowing look. But that was precisely why you were dangerous, my dear. You did not realize what you knew, but they did. Dr. Hayward exhaled. Harding must have believed that you had taken something incriminating when you fled. A letter, a document, a receipt, something that could link him to Langley's criminal dealings. Miss Marple smiled faintly. And so, my dear, while Langley wanted you gone, Harding wanted you silent. Eleanor shuddered, and he almost succeeded. Dr. Haywood's voice was firm. But he didn't, and he never will. Eleanor met his gaze, something steady and resolved growing in her own. No, he won't. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself summoned to Mrs. Lockridge's sitting room. The woman was seated in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, her hands resting limply in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than usual. So, it has come to this. Miss Marple took a seat opposite her. Yes, dear, it has. Mrs. Lockridge exhaled, her gaze distant. I suppose I ought to thank you, Miss Marple. You have exposed the truth, as was your intent. Miss Marple tilted her head. Was that not what you wished? Mrs. Lockridge was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, she spoke. I have spent years building this household, she murmured, maintaining its respectability, protecting my family name. She looked up at Miss Marple, her expression weary. And yet, in the end, I was blind to the true danger within my own walls. Miss Marple studied her carefully. A coup? You knew, didn't you? Or at the very least, you suspected. Mrs. Lockridge's jaw tightened. Harding was my husband's friend. He had been welcome in this house for years. I never imagined. She stopped herself, then exhaled. Perhaps I did, but I chose not to see. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but unrelenting, and in doing so, dear, you very nearly lost your niece. Mrs. Lockridge closed her eyes briefly. I know. Miss Marple set aside her knitting, leaning forward slightly. There is still time, Mrs. Lockridge. Time to do what is right. Eleanor needs her family now, more than ever. Mrs. Lockridge looked away, but there was a glimmer of something behind her guarded expression of sorrow. Perhaps, or even remorse. She did not speak again, but Miss Marple left the room, knowing that a change had begun that evening. Miss Marple prepared to leave Lockridge Manor. She had packed her small knitting bag, donned her sensible hat, and stepped onto the quiet gravel path, leading toward the village. Eleanor walked beside her, silent for a time. Then, at last, she said, Miss Marple, will I ever feel safe again? Miss Marple paused, looking toward the sky. The first stars had begun to prick through the dusky blue, shimmering faintly against the evening mist. Oh, my dear, she said softly, safety is never certain. Life has a way of unsettling even the most peaceful of places. Eleanor swallowed. Then how do we carry on? Miss Marple smiled, her eyes warm. By knowing ourselves. By remembering that, no matter how dark things may seem, the truth always has a way of coming to light. Eleanor exhaled, then gave a small, genuine smile. You're a remarkable woman, Miss Marple. Miss Marple chuckled. I do try, dear. They walked on in silence, the night stretching out before them calm. For now. But in the village of St. Mary Mead, were secrets nestled in the quiet corners of drawing rooms and tea shops. Miss Marple knew that there would always be another mystery waiting to be solved, and, as always, she would be ready.